Right now, a cold, dry tension is lingering at the back of your throat. A quiet panic that repeats every compliment you received today with deep suspicion. You are lying under the cover of darkness, but your mind is running an internal trial, reviewing your choices and checking your expressions to see if anyone noticed the exact second your confidence slipped. This is the exhaustion of the secret ledger, the private terror that your life's progress is just a clever trick of luck that might shatter before tomorrow afternoon. You feel like an intruder in your own achievements, waiting for the inevitable moment when the world finally realizes. You are not nearly as capable, balanced, or wise as they believe. Your chest is locked tight by this constant self-monitoring, worn out from carrying a hidden deficit that no amount of praise seems to fix. The space around your bed is cool and completely still, filled with the deep, clean scent of dry cedar wood and cold grain hulls, as if the air has drifted from an old winter storehouse. Outside your window, the late winter thaw has slowed down, and the damp earth is freezing back into a solid, quiet mass under a charcoal sky. There are no expectations to meet in this room, no panels of experts to satisfy, and no roles you must perform to keep your position secure. The shadows on your floor do not demand credentials. They simply rest against the wood panels, like dark grain settling into the bottom of a cedar bin, completely indifferent to what the world thinks you owe. In this silent sanctuary, you are released from the burden of proving your own existence. If it feels right, take a slow breath into the very center of your collarbones, letting the ribs widen without forcing your posture into an artificial stance. There is no need to force anything to shift in your mind right now, and you do not have to convince yourself that you are perfectly qualified for your life. What you are feeling in this heavy midnight hour is not a sign that you are broken, and it is not a failure of your spiritual path. This burning need to double-check your worth is simply the exhaustion of a mind that has spent years using a ghost balance, trying to weigh its own value in the dark by pouring handfuls of sand from one uncalibrated pan to another. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, because an anxious heart cannot be quieted by a harsh command to stop doubting. We are simply going to let the iron scales rest on the table. There is a strange, liberating paradox at the heart of your self-doubt, one that ancient Buddhist wisdom offers like a heavy stone placed at the foot of a wobbling pillar. The torment of feeling like an imposter does not happen because you are actually a liar or because you lack true capability. It happens because your mind is trying to protect a solid, permanent image of a self that doesn't actually exist. We construct an imaginary version of who we should be, a flawless, unshakable figure who never makes mistakes. And then we spend our nights tracking how far our real changing lives fall short of that blueprint. But the wisdom of the elders reminds us that you cannot be a fraud when there is no fixed, unmoving identity to deceive the world. Your life is not a scorecard to be checked. It is a stream of active choices. Trying to calibrate your ultimate worth through the lens of your flaws is like trying to stamp an imperial seal on the surface of a cloud. It is an unpayable debt. Dear friend, right now, maybe you have felt this too, the immense, bleeding fatigue that comes from keeping a private log of your vulnerabilities, believing that if you do not monitor your defects constantly, you will be caught unprepared by the world's judgment. We spend our days pretending we are entirely steady, wearing our confidence like a borrowed silk robe, while our inner landscape is raw from the fear of being unmasked. When we do this, our presence becomes stiff, performative, and fragile. We lose the heavy, unforced power of our true reality because we are too busy trying to measure our reflection in a warped glass. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. You do not have to find the ultimate proof of your competence before the clock reaches dawn. Nothing is required of you now. Absolutely nothing. You are safe enough to soften. The thick timber walls of this room do not ask for a certificate before they hold up the roof. The heavy stones in the foundation do not look for an official stamp before they carry the weight of the dark joists. Your spirit is allowed to have its awkward angles, its unpolished surfaces, and its moments of deep, quiet hesitation where you do not know the path forward. Your validity is not an academic degree you must defend against a hostile court. It is the immediate, physical mass of your body, resting right here in the quiet wood, completely supported by the dark floor beneath you. Slowly, the noise of your public performance begins to drop away as we lift our awareness from the corporate tables, the social conversations that have kept your jaw locked for days. Imagine yourself standing at midnight inside a dim, freezing grain shed at the high edge of a mountain monastery during the final days of winter. The air here is sharp and thin, smelling intensely of dried barley chaff, old hemp sackcloth, and the bitter smoke of a single whale oil lamp flickering on a rough oak workbench. The ground beneath your sandals is dust-dry, covered in fine hulls that crunch softly with every step, and the light is a pale amber glow that casts long, silent shadows across rows of heavy cedar storage bins. A few paces away, sitting on a low stool beside a pile of unworked grain bushels, is an old temple guardian named Master Soko. He moves with a slow, deliberate weight, his hands covered in thick, dark wool mittens that have been stained by decades of oil and grain dust, his face entirely relaxed in the dimness. He does not keep an active ledger. He does not have a scale hanging from his belt, and he does not look up at the mountain peaks with any need to prove his authority to the monks below. He simply sits by his quiet basket, listening to the dry, rhythmic hiss of barley sliding through a wooden funnel, waiting to see if you are ready to drop your private calculations. And look at the weight that has been carrying you since the beginning. As you step closer to his wooden table, the dry cold of the storehouse presses against your skin, grounding you in the immediate reality of this specific winter sanctuary. Soko does not give you an abstract speech about your potential or tell you that you are the most talented builder in the province. Instead, he reaches into a deep wicker basket at his feet and pulls out a single bronze measuring bushel that has been worn smooth around the rim by thousands of handfuls of raw seed. This is where we begin to see what your self-monitoring has done to your internal posture, and what we must learn to drop into the dark bins before the deep, healing sleep can find your eyes. The whale oil lamp flickered against the heavy cedar pillars of the storehouse, throwing long, liquid geometric shadows across the stacks of winter provisions. Master Soko held the bronze measuring bushel by its square rim, his woolen mittens catching the faint amber light as he turned the metal container slowly over the oak table. The dry hiss of sliding grain had stopped, leaving a profound, freezing silence that seemed to emphasize the sheer weight of the timber beams above. In the lower valleys of this district, Soko began to speak, his voice flat and unhurried, matching the steady drop of oil From the reservoir, there worked a young supervisor named Tanzan. He had been appointed by the district elders to manage the distribution of the winter barley to 7 mountain villages whose crops had been ruined by the early frost. It was a position of immense trust. The survival of hundreds of families depended on the accuracy of his measurements, and Tanzan was remarkably diligent. He worked from the first grey sliver of dawn until his oil lamp burned low, levelling every scoop with a flat cedar stick, ensuring that no village received a fraction less than its share. The elders openly praised his honesty, and the villagers bowed deeply when he passed their gates. Yet an agonizing hidden disease was consuming Tanzan's chest. Every night, after the massive oak doors of the granary were bolted, Tanzan would sit alone in his small room, his heart pounding against his ribs with a dry, vibrating terror. He became convinced that he was a profound fraud, that his hands were secretly clumsy, and that his apparent competence was merely a trick of lighting or luck. He believed that the wooden grain bushel he used was subtly warped by the mountain humidity, or that his levelling stick was bowing in the middle, causing him to distribute short measures without knowing it. He felt like an imposter who had stolen the robes of a true administrator, and he lived in constant horror of the morning, when an elder would inspect the bottom of a bin and find a deficit, exposing him to the entire province as an incompetent thief. Driven by this desperate compulsion to verify his own validity, Tanzan began a secret midnight ritual. He dragged a heavy cast iron merchant's balance into the coldest corner of the grain shed, far away from the eyes of the other workers. He would fill a coarse hemp sack with fine river sand, and for hours in the freezing dark, he would pour identical handfuls of the grey grit from one iron pan to the other. He would add a single grain of sand, watch the beam tip, remove it, and watch it swing back, searching with a dry throat for some microscopic error in his own touch. He was seeking an absolute calibration, a final, unshakable proof that his hands were true and that he had earned his place at the table. But the more he weighed the sand, the more elusive his certainty became. The iron scale seemed to shift with the temperature of his breath, and every micro-movement of the needle felt like a verdict confirming his secret inadequacy. His body became gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from the smoking whale oil, and his fingers were permanently cracked from the abrasive river sand. He was working himself to the point of collapse to defend an imaginary standard of perfection, while the real barley under his care remained perfectly balanced in its bins. His life had become an endless, private courtroom, and he was both the trembling prisoner and the merciless prosecutor, using a ghost balance to judge a crime that had never occurred. One midnight, as a bitter frost glaze formed over the cedar shingles of the roof, Tanzan stood over the iron balance, his teeth chattering in the dark, his hand shaking so violently that he spilled a stream of sand across the floorboards. His chest felt tight, filled with that specific, hollow panic that tells you that you are about to be unmasked. It was then that Master Soko entered through the small side door, his thick wool mittens tucked into his sleeves, his face illuminated by the pale lantern light. He did not shout at Tanzan for wasting the oil, nor did he check the ledgers to see if the grain counts were correct. Instead, he walked directly to the workbench, reached out, and placed his heavy, mittened hand squarely on the crossbeam of the iron balance, freezing its frantic swinging instantly. "Tell me, Tanzan," Soko murmured, his voice echoing softly in the rafters. What are you trying to settle on this table? Tanzan dropped his head, his tears freezing on his cheeks as he stared at the spilled grey sand on the oak grain table. I am trying to make sure that I am not a lie, master, he whispered, his voice cracking from the cold. Everyone thinks I am an honest supervisor, but I feel like a thief who doesn't know his own measurements. I am trying to find the exact weight that will prove I am allowed to hold this office. I am terrified that my bushel is false and that my whole life is a mistake. Soko did not offer a gentle reassurance or a certificate of praise. Instead, he reached into his leather pouch, pulled out a single, unworked riverstone that was completely rough, irregular, and unpolished, and dropped it heavily into one of the iron pans of the balance, causing the mechanism to clatter violently against the wood. Measure this stone using your sand, Tanzan, the old man commanded softly. Tell me how many grains of sand it takes to make this rock correct. Tanzan stared at the rough, dark stone, his breath hitching in his throat. It is impossible, master. The stone has no official weight. It wasn't shaped by an inspector, and its edges change depending on how it sits in the pan. Sand cannot make it correct because the stone is already exactly what it is. Soko lowered his eyes, his gaze resting on Tanzan's raw, sand-scratched thumbs. You have spent the entire winter trying to weigh your own soul on a merchant scale, the old man said gently. You have turned your own mind into a ghost balance, believing that your presence in this granary is a fraud until you can produce an imperial stamp that satisfies your fear. But your life is like this riverstone. It does not require a ledger to be heavy, and it does not need a certificate from the capital to hold its place in the dirt. Your work is not a lie. Your fear is the only thing that is false. You are breaking your own back, trying to calibrate a self that was never meant to be measured. Tanzan looked from the rough rock down to his own calloused palms, and then out at the dark, vast cedar bins that held the winter grain for the valley. In that freezing, quiet second, as the oil lamp smoked against the timber, a profound wave of emotional recognition passed through his chest. He saw that his true torment was not the warped bushel or the opinion of the village elders. It was the exhausting, daily act of running an internal trial against his own existence. He had turned his own mind into an uncalibrated scale, and he was being crushed by the phantom weight of his own suspicion. As you lie here, in the deep shelter of your dark room, let that image of the silent, unpolished riverstone rest in your awareness. Notice how completely it occupies its space without ever asking a scale if it has the right to be heavy. You do not need to verify your measurements tonight, and you do not need to prove to the dark that you have earned your rest. You can simply allow the iron pans to drop away from your fingers, letting the rigid architecture of your self-doubt dissolve into the cold, quiet grain of the floorboards. The dry grey sand remains scattered across the oak workbench, completely still, catching the dim residue of the lamp's amber glow as we rest with the echo of Tanzan's clattering scale. This image begins to move softly against the outer edges of your own hidden nighttime exhaustion. This ancient story is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold and indifferent to the actual quality of our work, our relationships, or our duties. It is not an invitation to live sloppily, to abandon your real responsibilities, or to step through your life with a careless, blank disregard for your impact on others. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal climate that allows our natural presence to return to its deep, unforced mass. When we look directly into the center of our midnight self-doubt, we find that the suffering we carry was not born from our actual human mistakes. The deepest ache was created by the specific way the mind held what happened. In the language of the awakened heart, what we often describe as the illusion of the fixed ego is that dry, tight clenching in your throat that says, if I am not entirely perfect and beyond criticism in every second, I am a total lie, I am an interloper, and I am a failure. It is the desperate grip that turns our natural desire for integrity into a rigid, suffocating ghost balance, straining to weigh our human worth against an impossible standard, while the simple truth of our actions remains completely unobserved by private anxieties. We call this craving, not a hunger for material comfort, but a desperate, exhausting thirst for an absolute certificate of approval before we allow ourselves to take a single breath of rest. When you spend your night mentally reviewing your old conversations, practicing your explanations, and trying to pre-correct every flaw, you are dragging an entire mountain of heavy ledger books onto the fragile floorboards of your present moment. You are loading your internal courthouse with evidence that belongs to an imaginary trial. One of the greatest insights of ancient wisdom is that we cannot always control the first pain, the sudden moment of clumsiness, the genuine gap in our knowledge, or the neutral fact that we are imperfect human beings growing through trial and error. But we can learn to stop adding a second wound to the first. The second wound is the one we inflict on ourselves when we treat our ordinary human limitations as proof of a fundamental fraud, turning our present awareness into a prison that smothers our own spirit. True mindfulness, when translated into the immediate language of your tired heart tonight, is simply the newly discovered ability to observe a self-doubting narrative without immediately treating it as an absolute truth. It is the capacity to notice that your mind is spinning a story about your inadequacy and to watch that thought happen without letting it load a single iron weight onto your scale. You can acknowledge the feeling of exposure without choosing to lock your body into a state of permanent defense. When you practice this, you begin to cultivate an inner surface that resembles the unpolished riverstone rather than the frantic needle of the balance. You become solid. You allow the praise and the criticism of the world to approach. You meet them with immense grace, but you do not allow their calibration to determine the ground of your existence. This brings us to the gentle, unburdened truth of non-self, which is the simple realization that you do not possess a single fixed personality that can be permanently unmasked or validated. Your identity is not a static document hidden in a drawer that someone can steal or expose. It is a continuous, changing stream of conditions and actions. Your uncertainty, your awkwardness, your moments of hesitation, these are not secret defects that prove you are a liar. They are simply temporary weather, moving over the landscape of your growth. The world will view your actions according to its own changing lenses, shaped by 1,000 biases you can neither predict nor control from your bed. Letting go does not mean you stop trying to do good work or abandon your care. It simply means you release the extra, unrequired struggle of trying to force a fluid life to fit an immutable certificate. You drop the illusion that you must prove your right to exist by weighing every breath on a scale of sand. Awareness is the wide, quiet space of this freezing storehouse that can hold both the grain and the empty air without taking sides. It is the part of you that is listening to this voice. Right now, the steady, untouched observer that remains completely free from the calculations of the horizontal world. You are not the defendant, standing before an angry judge. You are not the clerk who must balance the books before dawn to save his skin. You are the deep space itself, which knows how to hold the rough stone, without once doubting its own capacity to support the weight. When we touch this space, true compassion finally becomes an intimate reality. Compassion is not a soft sentiment. It is the immense, immovable courage to let your human form remain unpolished without turning that raw edge into a reason to punish your own chest. But the young supervisor had not yet discovered how to stay heavy when the records of his mind were dismantled, just as it may still be difficult for you to soften while your internal ledger feels so loud and authoritative. It is easy to understand the wisdom when the room is dark and the world is asleep, but the true transformation happens when we learn how to hold our uncertified reality, when the morning brings the crowd back to the threshold. As our boat of awareness drifts further into the amber shadows of the night, let these reflections bring you closer to the immediate reality of your own body. You have spent so much time living in the imaginary courtroom of your next evaluation, defending a self miles away, that your own skin has felt like an unfamiliar shelter. Now, let this clarity come home, moving down past the definitions and the calculations, directly into the heavy, quiet truth of your breath and the bed where you rest. If it feels right, let your awareness gently drop down from the horizontal world of upcoming evaluations and past conversations, settling directly into the immediate, physical chamber of your chest. There is absolutely no need to force your breathing, to slow down by an act of will, or to demand that your body achieve a state of perfect porcelain stillness right now. Instead, you might simply observe the unforced, natural weight of your breath as it fills the back of your lungs, widening your ribs slightly against the surface beneath you. Notice how each inhalation arrives with a subtle, cool spaciousness, like the air inside a quiet granary filled with dry cedar wood, and how each exhalation carries away a tiny fraction of the heat your nervous system has stored throughout the day. Even noticing this single shift is entirely enough. Perhaps you can locate the specific places where your body is surrendering its weight to the fabric of the bed. Feel the heavy, dense curve of your shoulders sinking down, the flat expanses of your thighs relaxing, and the back of your head resting fully in its place. As you follow the rhythm of your chest, see if you can invite the very small muscles around your throat to unlatch. There is an ancient, tight guarding. We hold there a subtle clenching of the jaw that comes from constantly trying to calibrate our expressions, trying to brace ourselves against the feeling of being found out tomorrow. Let that armor drop. Allow the skin across your forehead to become smooth and soft, like the surface of a dark, unworked river stone when the evening wind completely dies away. Now, without any trace of frustration or self-judgment, notice one specific scenario or memory that has been persistently asking for your attention tonight. It might be the remembered shadow of a meeting where you felt out of place, the heavy anxiety of an upcoming task you feel unqualified for, or that low-grade alarm that whispers you must pre-correct every flaw to keep your life from shattering. Do not try to push this mental visitor out of the room, and do not try to use your willpower to crush it. If we fight our self-doubt, we are merely applying more pressure to our internal balances, causing the needle in our spirit to swing more frantically. Instead, just let this thought be seen. exactly as it is, holding it with a quiet, spacious permission. Imagine that you are holding that heavy, uncalibrated iron pan that Tanzan used in the freezing dark. Feel the cold, rough texture of its rim and notice the dusty weight of it pressing into your palms, straining your wrists under its mass. In your mind's eye, see yourself taking this current worry, this frantic need to prove your validity, and placing it gently into the pan itself, letting the iron absorb the exact shape of your alarm. Watch the liquid of that anxiety seep into the micro cracks of the dark metal, filling the balance until it holds the absolute weight of your anticipation. Notice what happens as you hold this image in your imagination. You do not need to lift the scale above your head, and you do not need to settle the beam. You are simply the observer, looking directly at the heavy iron pan without allowing its mass to crush your present house. The evaluation belongs to the imaginary trial. The balance belongs to the storehouse. You are simply the space that allows both to exist. You are letting the frantic energy rest inside the iron without letting it splinter your own bones. Now, if it feels right, imagine leaning down and sliding that iron balance into a vast, deep bin filled with millions of grains of raw, dark millet. Let your fingers slowly release their grip on its sides, allowing your hands to open wide in your bed, palms facing upward toward the ceiling. Watch what happens in the darkness of your mind when you stop trying to balance this weight on your table. The iron pan drops through the small round grains, settling softly into the deep, warm, dark at the bottom of the bin, where the weight of the millet naturally buries the metal until its edges can no longer be seen. Watch the image change as the storehouse fills with a thick, protective winter shadow. The sharp lines of the balance lose their definition in the amber dimness. The worry becomes smaller, turning into a faint whisper, then into a quiet silence, until it merges completely with the vast, uniform stillness of the grain pile. The cedar bin is wide enough to hold 1,000 heavy scales without its own deep foundation being broken. You do not need to watch the iron vanish completely. You can return to the heavy, grounding safety of your own breath whenever you are ready. There is an immense, unburdened freedom in allowing yourself to realize that your life does not have to be an inspected commodity built against a ledger. Tonight, your only assignment is to let your presence find its own natural weight, undisturbed by the scales that may or may not be waiting for you next week. You do not need to validate your entire history before the sun rises, and you do not have to force a sudden emotional breakthrough. Simply resting your attention on the unhurried edge of your own skin is a profound form of wisdom. You are drawing your energy back from the horizontal courtroom, allowing the internal mass of your spirit to pool in your chest, soft, dark, and perfectly valid in its own quiet space. But the old grain warden has not finished his work in the granary, and the young supervisor's transformation had a much deeper layer to reveal when the threshold of the storehouse became slick with the spring thaw. In a moment, this journey will take us into a season of deep transition where we will discover how a simple doorstep can hold the world without ever being stamped by an inspector. For now, let your ribs expand into the cool, dark room, feeling the absolute luxury of being completely unmeasured by anyone, anywhere, for the rest of this night. The amber dimness of the storehouse seemed to expand into the corners of the rafters as Master Soko pulled his thick wool mittens tighter over his wrists. his boots making no sound against the layer of loose barley chaff on the floorboards. The late winter thaw was beginning to crack the ice outside the granary walls, sending a low, rhythmic dripping of water down from the cedar eaves. A soft ticking sound that marked the slow, inevitable movement of the season. When the spring mud finally broke across the high passes, Soko continued, his voice dropping into a deeper, more resonant tone that seemed to vibrate directly through the floor. The district elders arrived at the mountain granary for the formal seasonal review. They brought with them a master scribe from the provincial capital, a sharp-eyed clerk who carried heavy ink blocks, long hairbrushes, and a grand scroll bound in yellow silk designed to record the exact efficiency of every distribution supervisor in the region. For Tanzan, this was the ultimate manifestation of his lifelong nightmare. Had been buried in the millet bin, but the hunger for an absolute certificate of validation still pulled fiercely at the muscles of his throat as the scribe began verifying the wooden bushels and checking the grain counts against the village tallies. A profound, suffocating panic returned to Tanzan's chest. He stood in the center of the main hall, his skin turning cold and damp under his hemp tunic. His eyes locked onto the tip of the clerk's brush. Every stroke of black ink on the yellow silk felt like a weapon that could pierce his identity, exposing his internal awkwardness to the entire mountain community. The elders stood in a quiet row, nodding at the cleanliness of the bins, and the head monk openly praised Tanzan for saving the villagers from starvation. Yet, instead of receiving their praise as a soothing ointment, the words felt like hot coals placed in his palms. He felt like a bigger thief than before, a clever trickster who had managed to deceive even the most analytical eyes in the province. His internal prosecutor was shouting so loudly that he could barely hear the scribe's official declaration of accuracy. When the review concluded, the master scribe rolled the yellow silk scroll, bowed with great formality, and stepped through the threshold, leaving Tanzan standing alone by the empty ledgers. His heart was racing, his mind looping through 100 past conversations, trying to remember if he had smiled too long or if his voice had trembled during the questioning, searching for the small leak that would eventually cause his reputation to collapse. Master Soko walked over to the heavy oak doors, his face completely untouched by the grand administrative display, and looked at the young supervisor whose fingers were still gripping the table so tightly that the knuckles were white. "Come, Tanzan," the old man said, pointing toward the main entrance, where the mountain trail dipped down into the melting slush. "The carts have left a deep mess at the threshold. We must clear the entry slate before the evening frost locks the mud into iron." Tanzan followed the old keeper out into the sharp, wet air, his knees feeling weak from the hours of intense self-monitoring. At the very center of the granary entrance lay a massive, unpolished slab of dark river slate that served as the doorstep. For 3 generations, every monk, every traveling merchant, every heavy grain cart, and every mud-soaked pack mule had stepped squarely on this stone to enter the storehouse. The relentless friction of thousands of boots had worn a smooth, shallow groove right down its center, and the edges were rough, chipped, and completely unaligned with the neat timber lines of the doorframe. It possessed no imperial seal. It had never been measured by the scribe's brush, and it carried no certificate from the capital declaring it a valid piece of architecture. Soko handed Tanzan a heavy, split bamboo broom, and knelt down by the wet slate, running his thick mitten over the grooved center where the muddy water had pooled. "Look at this doorstep, Tanzan," the old man instructed softly, his breath forming a faint white cloud in the damp air. "Tell me if this stone passed the provincial scribe's review today." Tanzan leaned on his broom, the cold wind tugging at his sleeves. "The stone doesn't have an entry in the ledger, Master. It isn't a certified part of the administration. It's just an old rock we found in the creek when the foundation was dug. It has no official value." Soko lifted his head, his dark eyes reflecting the grey expanse of the fading sky. "And yet," the old keeper murmured, his voice carrying the deep mass of the valley floor, "without this uncertified stone, every grain cart would have sunk into the spring bog, and the grand cedar pillars above us would have rotted into the mud 40 winters ago. This slate has held the weight of the entire province's survival, without ever asking a clerk if its dimensions were correct. It does not wait for a yellow scroll to give it permission to be solid. It holds the door because it is simply here, unpolished, unmeasured, and entirely real." Tanzan stood entirely still. On the wet earth, the bamboo bristles of the broom pressing against his palms. He looked at the deep, smooth groove in the dark, river slate, the beautiful, unrefined mark of decades of quiet, unrecorded utility. He did not experience a magical, sudden erasure of his internal anxiety, and the memory of his past hesitations did not miraculously vanish from his brain. The reality of his changing, imperfect human nature remained exactly as it was vulnerable, prone to doubt, and lacking a permanent guarantee of success. But as he stared at the groove threshold, Tanzan made one small, subtle shift within his own chest. He took a long, deep breath of the damp mountain air, allowing his ribs to expand completely, and he stopped the habit of treating his fearful thoughts as the truth of who he was. He stopped resisting the fact that he was an unpolished human being who was still learning how to manage the barley. He looked down at the mud left by the scribe's cart, and with a slow, disciplined precision, he began to sweep the slate clean, choosing to inhabit the immediate scraping sound of the bamboo against the rock. Rather than the imaginary courtroom in his head. He was forgiving his presence for being rough around the edges, letting go of his frantic need for an official certificate, and choosing to sit with the simple, uncertified utility of his actions. He was no longer trying to be an imperial monument. He was resting as the doorstep, as you rest in the absolute safety of your dark room. Tonight, let that image of the grooved river slate settle into the deep soil of your own heart. Notice how it does not apologize for its rough edges, and how it does not ask the boots that step on it for a letter of recommendation. You do not need to secure a certificate of perfection before the sun rises, and you do not need to prove your legitimacy by outthinking the evaluations of the world. You can allow the unpolished terrain of your life to be exactly as solid as it is, trusting that the capacity to bear your weight is already woven into the very fabric of your being. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the thawing ice dripping from the cedar eaves continues to fill the dark spaces of your room, washing over your thoughts until the whole night smells of damp cedar and resting earth. As you lie perfectly still in this blue sanctuary of shadow, we can begin to unpack the complex, exhausting mechanism that keeps your mind running a secret trial while the rest of the world is asleep. It is not the external challenges or the actual difficulty of your tasks that drains your spirit of its natural joy. The deep fatigue you feel is born from the relentless internal friction of self-judgment, that constant, defensive habit of trying to fix your perceived flaws through a quiet, burning sense of shame. When you spend your midnight hours replaying old conversations, checking your past performance for the exact moment you looked clumsy, and rehearsing your defenses for tomorrow, you are engaging in a fierce, silent resistance to your own human nature. You are operating under the painful, mistaken belief that if you do not monitor your imperfections with absolute cruelty, you will somehow be exposed as an absolute lie. This desperate need for approval turns your mind into a frantic clerk who is constantly checking a ghost balance, trying to weigh your fundamental worth against an imaginary standard of absolute perfection. You allow the praise and the criticism of others to become a permanent verdict on your right to exist, turning your temporary moments of awkwardness into a heavy, static identity. You stop being a real human being who is learning how to navigate an unmapped season, and you become the imposter, the fraud, the person who must always double-check their own reflection before they are permitted to rest. This is where the ancient, clear-sighted psychology of Buddhist wisdom offers a profound doorway out of your self-made prison, speaking directly to the immediate ache of your heart without a single word of academic jargon. The teachings show us that every life is touched by two entirely distinct forms of pain. The first pain is simply what life brings, the raw, unedited landscape of a world we do not control. It is the neutral fact that we cannot know everything, the natural occurrence of a mistake, or the sudden, icy shift in our external circumstances. This first pain is clean. It carries no personal malice and no judgment. It is merely the changing weather of existence. It is like the rough, chipped edges of the dark river slate at the door of the storehouse. The second pain, however, is entirely what the mind throws over that stone. The second pain is the bitter layer of self-condemnation, panic, and comparison that we pour into our own wounds. It is the voice that insists your hesitation is a crime and that you must build a flawless, ironclad persona to hide your ordinary vulnerability from the world. We cannot always stop the first pain. We cannot force the people around us to always see us clearly, nor can we prevent ourselves from occasionally stumbling when the trail becomes slick with spring mud. But we can absolutely learn to stop feeding the second pain. We can refuse to let our thoughts turn a simple moment of human uncertainty into an indictment of our entire soul. True peace, when met in the deep darkness of this room tonight, is never the complete absence of difficulty. It is not an imaginary, pristine terrace where your work is always effortless and your confidence never wavers. Peace is simply a fundamentally altered relationship with that difficulty. It means looking at the rough, uncertified surfaces of your life and choosing to meet them the way the massive doorstep meets the heavy carts. It means letting your presence be exactly as heavy and unpolished as it is right now, without converting that unrefined edge into a reason to doubt your own mass. When you allow your unique stream to flow without the added torment of trying to stamp an official seal on every wave, the tightness in your throat begins to dissolve like dry sand, falling into a deep bin of millet. Have you ever wondered what happens when you simply grant your presence permission to be uncalibrated by a ledger? What happens when you drop the requirement to prove your legitimacy before you allow your body to surrender to the bed? The universe does not collapse when you Step out of the horizontal courtroom of your own self-monitoring. It simply continues its ancient, unhurried growth without your panic, your drive to constantly rehearse. Your adequacy is not proof of your integrity. It is merely a fearful attempt to protect an imaginary self from the deep, beautiful vulnerability of being alive. As we allow these truths to sink through the layers of your exhaustion, the sharp, analytical quality of your thoughts begins to lose its grip on your chest. You are not required to be a flawless monument, and you do not need to pretend that your hesitation feels pleasant. It is simply the current texture of your ground. In a moment, we will look at how this ancient clarity shows up in the small, ordinary frictions of your next afternoon. But for right now, let your shoulders sink heavily into the mattress, feeling the immense relief of knowing that you do not have to be a certified masterpiece to be whole. You are allowed to be the unpolished stone that holds the door. Now let this ancient clarity step down from the mountain granary and enter the concrete, noisy spaces of your modern daily life, moving out of the thawing hills and directly into the small, fragmented moments that test your spirit between sunrise and dusk. True, inner alignment is not something we save for a quiet walk near a grain table. It is practiced in the very ordinary, friction-filled intervals of your routine. It is found in that brief, suspended second before you unlock your phone to check for a reassurance text that hasn't arrived, or when you are sitting at your kitchen table late at night, staring at a list of expenses, trying to maintain a brave face while feeling an immense, cold heaviness inside your stomach. Think of how many times a day your internal pillars begin to groan and splinter because you are tracking the visible stability of people on a screen, or because you are trying to manage the unexpressed moods of a partner, a friend, or an employer. We spend our precious hours replaying an accidental mistake we made during a brief afternoon meeting, or comparing our vulnerable, hidden journey with the polished, solid arrivals of those who seem to move through life without a single landslide. We carry a constant, phantom guilt that tells us we are permanently lagging behind, that our exposure is a proof of deficiency, and that any hour we spend resting must somehow be paid for through a prior state of complete emotional collapse. But look at what happens when you bring the memory of the unpolished river doorstep into these small, vibrating moments of your afternoon. You begin to realize that a single breath taken before you respond to an aggressive demand is not just a pause. It is a profound form of personal wisdom. It is the moment you step out of the heavy stone fortress. You are choosing to care deeply about your world without gripping its outcomes so tightly that you tear your own skin. You can offer your love to a person or your dedication to a project without allowing the frantic speed of the market to dictate the rhythm of your heart. Not every urgent thought that crosses your mind deserves your blind obedience, and not every heavy feeling you experience is a command to go out and repair your entire destiny when your mind whispers that you are failing because someone else has achieved their perfect structure early. You can treat that thought like water striking the river slate. Let it exist. Let it be cold. Let it be exactly what it is. But let it flow past your center and drop down into the river without altering the deep, natural root of your life. You do not have to build a monument of ledger lines around every worry that flies your way. You can want rest without needing to justify its necessity to anyone, including your own internal critic. You do not need to wait until your body breaks or your mind goes completely numb before you are permitted to set down the heavy iron weights. Rest is not a luxury you earn by matching the hardness of the ledger pages. It is the natural, quiet ground that allows your unique nature to survive the winter freeze. When you step back from the urge to protect yourself against every future evaluation, you are not abandoning your safety. You are simply ensuring that there will be a living, unpolished center left beneath the frost to bear the carts when the real traffic arrives. Tomorrow, when the alerts flash, or when you feel the old impulse to check your position against the world's clock, remember that your life is allowed to be uncertified. You can look at the rigid fortifications across the valley with immense kindness. You can celebrate their stability, but you do not need to freeze your own river to match their layout. You can establish a clear, quiet boundary within yourself that says, they are standing with their imperial certificates, but I am learning the strength that knows how to hold the door without a stamp. Slowly, the noise of your anticipated obligations begins to fade, drawing you further away from the demands of the horizontal world. The small details of your day, the unanswered messages, the complex goals, the fears about whether you will ever be enough, are all losing their sharp, punishing definition in the dark. In a moment, our journey will reach its final, deepest destination, where the internal trial drops its boundaries entirely and dissolves into the absolute stillness of the earth. Let the weight of your balance slide down into the floorboards, knowing that for the next few hours, your unrefined reality is the most resilient thing you possess. The low, rhythmic ticking of the thawing ice dripping from the cedar eaves has dropped its voice entirely now, leaving the dark mountain ridge in a state of absolute, unmoving silence. Every rigid calculation you tried to balance over the tomorrow of your life has begun to unhook, detaching itself from the beams of your mind and sliding silently into the deep, dark millet bins. The artificial courtrooms have been entirely dismantled, for the frantic prosecutor within your own thoughts has finally set down the heavy ledgers, allowing the current of your spirit to pool in the unpolished threshold of your own frame, where no metrics exist and no one is coming to inspect the grain count. Your breathing has become very quiet now, a slow, deep softening that feels less like an intentional effort and more like water slowly soaking through the grain sacks at midnight. With each long, unhurried release of air, your limbs are becoming heavier, sinking into the mattress as if the clay of your body is finally remembering its connection to the unworked river slate that knows exactly how to bear its own mass through the hardest winter. The fine vibrating splits that you carried through the busy afternoon are closing, sealed by the absolute darkness and the thick, protective boundary of this silent room. There is nothing left to weigh. The ancient cedar joints of your inner house have been relieved of their unnatural burden, resting on a foundation that has no urgency, supporting nothing but the deep, velvety blackness of a night that has forgotten how to calibrate the wind. You have been given full, unconditional permission to be entirely uncertified tonight. You do not need to keep watch over the shifting needle of the balance, and you do not need to ensure that your safety is completely guaranteed before the sun rises over the ridge. The iron pan is deep beneath the millet, and the entire northern threshold is sleeping under a heavy, seamless blanket of grey shadow. Let your chest widen into the cool air one final time, feeling the immense, unburdened luxury of a space that is completely unobserved, unmeasured, and exempt from the requirement to produce a single perfect answer for anyone else. The obligations of your next year have been released from your fingers. The timelines you feared have been dropped into the river mud. The roles you played to maintain an appearance of absolute certainty have been left on the wet trail. You are allowed to stop solving your whole life for tonight. You are allowed to return to the deep, unrefined stillness that existed before you ever learned how to turn your vulnerability into a crime. The bed beneath you is completely steady, a solid foundation of ancient rock and dark loam that requires no bracing or engineering from your tired brain. Let the truths you have heard tonight sink past your analytical thoughts, past your self-judgments, down into the deepest marrow of your bones, turning into a heavy, silent mass that will keep your core intact without requiring a single certificate. The night is wide, the earth is cold, and your unpolished nature is entirely valid in its willingness to hold the door without an imperial stamp. As the final embers of your vigilance turn to cool ash, the image of Master Soko and the young supervisor, Tanzan, dissolves entirely into the dark wood of your room. The granary is gone, the yellow scroll is gone, and the heavy iron balance has vanished into the evening mist. There is only this mattress, this rising chest, and the vast, unburdened spaciousness of a spirit that has finally stopped trying to measure its own worth. Sleep is not a destination you must earn by proving your right to exist. It is simply the natural grounding of the stone when the darkness becomes total. Let the night fold over you like damp mountain earth over an unworked river slab. And as you drift into that deep, undisturbed stillness where no calculations can reach you, let your heart rest in the absolute safety of its own unrecorded mass, knowing that the stone has never required an inspector's mark to carry the weight of the roof. What if the quiet space you have been trying to fill with achievements is not a hole that exposes your failure, but a wide cedar bin designed to hold you completely safe until the spring? The dark air expands into that question, filling the deep spaces of your consciousness like winter mist settling into the low hollows of an abandoned mountain valley. It is a stillness that does not ask your mind to produce an explanation, nor does it look for an intellectual resolution to the years you spent running. It simply hovers around your shoulders, thick and heavy, allowing the frantic architecture of your fears to lose its remaining density. The image of the north-facing threshold remains, with you in the quiet, a vast, dark shelter where the earth does not apologize for its shadows. In that cleft, the river slate does not strive to become smoother before its time. It does not look across the trail to see if the polished marble steps of the palace have a better name, or if the golden pillars are receiving more praise from the passing scholars. It rests completely in its own chilly moisture, unhurried, silent, and perfectly continuous with its own unrefined nature. You can feel the luxury of that unhurried ground as your weight settles deeper into the fabric of your bed. There is a soft, unfolding space in the center of your lower belly, a complete release of that tight, hidden anchor that usually keeps your nervous system vibrating with the speed of the world. That tightness was the physical shape of your self-monitoring, the muscle memory of an uncalibrated scale trying to balance itself over an impossible void to prove it. Isn't broken, but tonight, the void has vanished. The mattress beneath your limbs is entirely steady, absorbing your fatigue without requiring you to justify your placement on the earth. You can let go of the perimeter of your achievements. You can let go of the invisible ledger you have been using to measure the depth of your own life. In the quietest currents of the awakened mind, we are reminded that our true nature is not the fragile, calibrated mechanism that fractures under pressure, but the massive, unpolished stone beneath that knows how to find the lowest, darkest hollow and rest there without shame. The needle may swing, the balance may rust in the shed, and the wooden bushels may fail to match the official records of the capital. But the underlying ground itself remains permanently unhurt, completely unchanged by the accuracy of the counts or the weight of the cargo it touches. Tonight, you are returning to that ground. You are moving your sense of self away from the brittle, defensive sheets of status, comparison, and public arrival, and you are resting as the deep, dark threshold that remains still beneath the ice. Let your breath become even quieter now, a faint, almost invisible tide that moves through your body, like the slow seeping of winter moisture through an ancient cedar root. You do not need to pull the air in with a sense of urgency, and you do not need to push it out as if you are running out of time. The body knows exactly how to navigate its own internal seasons, just as the mountain knows how to hold the snow, and the wild barley seed knows how to sit in the black mud for months without losing its core. There is absolutely nothing for you to calculate in this room. The peers who occupied your thoughts during the day are sleeping under their own roofs, surrounded by their own private trials, dealing with the unique conditions of their own ground. Your anxiety cannot speed up their dawn, and your self-condemnation cannot heal your own delay. You can let them have their scrolls while you claim your shadow. Imagine the dark, heavy texture of the raw river slate, one last time, not as a symbol outside of yourself, but as the very density of your heart tonight. Its grain is so thick, so completely hardened by the cold wisdom of this mountain, that even the sharpest sting of someone else's evaluation cannot pierce its boundary. The gold across the valley may shine. It may illuminate the entire southern ridge, but it cannot make this stone rot. It cannot force a flawless surface that would split in the winter air. When the true traffic arrives, the rock will bear it naturally, quietly, according to its own organic placement, leaving you whole, rooted, and beautifully aligned with your own ground. You do not need to mimic the polished tiles of the shrine to know the power of your own mass. The house around you has dropped its last daytime echo now, the distant sounds of the streets fading into a soft, uniform blanket of quiet that matches the slow thrumming of your pulse. Your tongue is soft against the floor of your mouth. Your throat is entirely relaxed, and your eyelids are resting with a heavy, leaden weight, no longer searching the dark for a sign of where you stand. The future is an unformed landscape that does not require your mapping tonight. The past is a fallen grain that cannot be gathered again by your sleeplessness. Both are completely irrelevant to the immediate, dark reality of this cold air moving through your frame. Let yourself sink an inch further into the dark, feeling the immense relief of being entirely left behind by the world's clocks. No one is tracking your arrival. Here, no one is comparing your score. No one is evaluating your timeline, and no one is demanding that you explain why your metrics are still unverified. You are completely anonymous in this winter. Your value has returned to its natural, unearned state, the same silent worth of a boulder leaning over a creek or a flake of frost settling onto the black muck of the cliff threshold. As the final embers of your resistance turn to cool ash, the image of Master Soko and the young supervisor Tanzan dissolves entirely into the dark wool of your room. The granary is gone, the yellow scroll is gone, and the heavy iron balance has vanished into the evening mist. There is only this mattress, this rising chest, and the vast, unburdened spaciousness of a spirit that has finally stopped trying to force its own validation. Sleep is not a destination. You must earn through a day of perfect progress. It is simply the natural closing of the seed when the darkness becomes total. Let the night fold over you like wet earth over an unpolished doorstep. And as you drift into that deep, undisturbed stillness where no metrics exist, let this one final truth rest against your chest. You were never meant to be a certified masterpiece hanging on a courtroom wall. You were only ever meant to be the deep, patient stone that knows how to bear its own holiness in the dark. What if the emptiness you have been running from was never a sign of failure, but the wide, open valley where your soul finally learns how to rest without asking for permission from the balance? The vast darkness absorbs that question without a sound, widening like an unlit storehouse that has thrown its doors completely open to the winter sky. There is no echo, no resistance, and no immediate rush to answer, because the space you have entered does not operate by the rules of the ledger or the clock. It is an immense, heavy quiet that spreads into the small, tight hollows of your ankles, your calves, and the deep, hidden spaces behind your knees, melting away the residual static of a lifetime spent keeping score. You can feel the physical reality of this release moving through you like the slow, cool descent of mountain water, finding its way through layers of porous river gravel, the frantic necessity to look capable, to appear arrived, and to pretend that your inner world is perfectly organized, has been set down on the banks of this night, leaving you completely unburdened and beautifully anonymous in the shadow. We have spent so many cycles of the moon running from our own ordinary human uncertainty, believing that if we show a single unpolished edge, the world will discard us as broken vessels. We have turned our own minds into relentless inspectors, standing over our hearts with long hairbrushes and permanent ink, writing verdicts across every memory of our hesitation. But as you lie here in the deep, protective dark, the great, unhurried sanity of the ancient masters begins to rest upon your chest like a thick wool blanket that has been warmed by a wood fire. It reminds you that the trees on the northern cliff do not spend their winters in an agony of comparison because they have grown crooked in the gale. They do not look down at the straight pines in the valley and feel like impostors who have failed the design of the forest. They hold the ridge precisely because they are supple, because they are rough, and because they have allowed their shapes to be carved by the actual wind, rather than an imaginary blueprint. Think of how much energy it has stolen from your life to constantly monitor your position, to check your expression in the mirror of other people's expectations, to brace your shoulders against the terrifying suspicion that you are merely a fraud who has wandered into a lucky room. That performance is what cracks the cedar beams of your spirit. That is the internal heat that causes your nervous system to vibrate until your throat feels dry and your jaw is locked like an iron latch. But tonight, the courtroom has closed its gates for the season. The scribes have rolled up their yellow silk scrolls. and departed down the mountain trail, and the elders are sleeping soundly under their own heavy roofs. Untroubled by your measurements, there is no one left to witness your defense, and there is no one asking you to prove that you are qualified to take your next breath. Let your focus settle gently into the very centers of your palms, noticing how the skin there's softened, losing that tight defensive grip that usually prepares you to lift the heavy iron tools of your daily justification. These hands have held the weight of an unpayable debt, trying to balance an imaginary account book in the dark by shifting handfuls of sand from pan to pan. Feel how completely empty they are right now. Resting flat against the sheets with the fingers slightly curled, neutral and silent, like two smooth river stones that have dropped to the bottom of a deep, unmoving mountain pool. They are holding no credentials. They are defending no titles. They are simply resting on the earth, perfectly valid in their stillness, requiring no certificate of efficiency to belong to your body. As your hands soften, let that same quality of absolute surrender climb through your wrists, your forearms, and settle into the broad, tired expanse of your shoulders. The invisible yoke of comparison has been unbuckled and set down in the mud of the trail. The phantom ledger of your neighbor's success has been burned to cool ash in the fireplace. You do not have to carry the water across the unnatural ridges tonight, and you do not have to ensure that your fields are flourishing before you allow your eyelids to close. The mountain is at peace. The storehouse is dark, and the great threshold stone is holding the weight of the roof without a single word of complaint. The universe is perfectly capable of maintaining its balance without your panic, and the stars can find their paths across the sky while you sink into the deep, dark mud of your own rest. Consider the immense, silent dignity of that unpolished doorstep that Master Soko showed the young supervisor at the end of the thaw. It did not survive the decades of heavy traffic by trying to become as smooth as a palace mirror, or by weeping because its edges were chipped by the iron cartwheels. It survived because it trusted its own density. It stayed heavy, it stayed still, and it allowed the mud, the boots, and the seasons to pass over its surface without letting a single scratch alter its connection to the deep foundation beneath. When the freezing thoughts of your own inadequacy try to wake your mind tomorrow, you do not need to build an aggressive wall of defense or throw yourself into a frantic rush to catch up with the world. You can simply allow your inner space to become wide, dark, and hollow like the granary vault. Let the praise and the criticism of the world enter your awareness and pass straight through without leaving a single mark of vanity or shame on your heart. You can be the heavy slate that bears all things without needing an official stamp to be solid. The air in your bedroom seems to grow thicker, cooler, wrapping around your temples like a soft, dark wool that has been washed in mountain snow. The rhythm of your heart has settled into a deep, slow thud, a steady, comforting beat that has been keeping time for your life since before you had a name, a career, or an identity to defend. It does not look at your ledger to see if you have earned your placement on the mattress. It does not require you to achieve a specific status before it keeps your blood moving through the dark. It functions perfectly well in the deep, secret chamber of your chest, entirely independent of your social scores and your midnight evaluations. You can trust its rhythm. You can trust the deep, organic intelligence of your nature to rebuild your spirit while you are away in the dark. Let go of the need to have a clear map for the next decade of your life. You do not need to figure out how you will explain your delays to the people who expect more from you, or how you will navigate the complex demands of the upcoming season. Those choices do not belong to the midnight hours, they belong to the sun. And when the sun arrives, the clarity you need will emerge naturally. From the reservoir of this deep rest, to try to fix your identity while your spirit is exhausted is like trying to clear a muddy pool by stirring the water with an iron rod. You must let the movement stop first. You must let the sediment settle to the bottom until the liquid becomes perfectly clear, still, and dark. Feel the heavy, soothing drag of sleep pulling at the very edges of your awareness. Now like a slow tide gathering up the loose gravel on the shoreline of an unmapped mountain lake. The words you are hearing are no longer concepts to be analyzed. They are simply a low, rhythmic frequency that is gently rocking the hull of your resting frame. The bed beneath you is completely safe. The darkness around you is deep, wide, and entirely supportive, holding your weight without asking for a single line of justification. It does not care about your productivity, your age, or your arrivals. It simply carries you because you are a part of this ancient, unpolished earth. Let your consciousness dissolve entirely into that supportive depth, returning to the vast, subterranean well where all individual streams find their rest. You are sliding past the layers of grey stone, past the frozen roots of the cedar trees, down into the pristine, untouched stillness of the deep ground, where there is no leader, there is no follower, and there is no race. There is only the boundless, dark peace of a spirit that has finally remembered how to be completely still within its own skin. And as the last trace of the waking world fades into the winter fog, let your heart rest in the absolute safety of its own unhurried mass, knowing that nothing you survive today has the power to diminish the pristine, beautiful truth of your unpolished nature. What if the tomorrow you have been spending your life trying to conquer is waiting to receive you not as an inspector, but as a deep pool that already knows how to cradle your weight the moment you stop trying to balance the scale?